Hey, Godfather of Anxiety here. I just wanted to make a short video about something that I think is a really important negative thought pattern that many of us with anxiety and depression battle on a daily basis. And that's personalization. Personalization, we might think of it, we might start thinking about depersonalization. That has nothing to do with this, and it's not anything to do with, customizing something for a specific person. As it pertains to mental health, personalization is a cognitive distortion where we blame ourselves for literally everything. Things that we have no power or control over, we somehow make it something personal. This can also be something where we have a misplaced sense of responsibility for, again, things that are completely out of our control. And while initially this thought pattern might not seem as dangerous, as it can be, if you think about it, really, when it takes hold and we start to feel the blame and the weight of everything going on around us, every negative thing, and again, the mental health field calls this cognitive distortion. They call it personalization, but I really think it should be called negative personalization, because that's where it goes. It goes towards always thinking something negative to do with you, negative to do with you personally. And, if you take this this thought pattern far enough, it definitely could lead you to a very dark place. Especially if you're already clinically depressed, this is the type of thought pattern that I believe could lead somebody to making a mistake and choosing not to be here anymore. So this is a really important negative thought pattern to address, and that's why I wanted to talk about it in the video today. As far as symptoms of personalization, what's going to happen is we're going to have a pervasive pattern of negative self-talk and constant feelings of guilt and self-doubt. And you can hear people, I've heard myself, I've fallen into this thought pattern before, for sure, where you're not only feeling guilty about the things you should be doing and haven't done, but you can feel bad about anything from your family's actions, people in your family's actions, to world events, right? I mean, if you let this run wild enough, you can be blaming yourself for, the Kennedy assassination. And, that sounds funny, but when you are stuck in this thought pattern, there's nothing funny about it. It is a destroyer of self-esteem, because you feel like everything that you have anything to do with even is negative. And here we go again. And if something happens to somebody, something bad, all of a sudden somehow it's going back in your mind, it's going back to you in something you didn't do that you should have done, or something that you did that you shouldn't have done. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that we can't control other people's actions. There is such a thing as free will, and unfortunately, people make bad decisions, right? This will happen. This happens all the time. We will make bad decisions, but those will be our decisions. And, you can't control what other people do. Another thing this is going to do, it's going to perpetuate anxiety, because it's a type of magical thinking, if you would, where you're thinking that not only are you in control of things you're not in control of, but you're negatively impacting everything things that, have nothing to do with you. So it's, when are you going to feel good, right? And another thing that'll happen with this type of negative thought pattern is we'll make connections that are completely fictitious and fallacious. They will have nothing to do with reality. We'll start thinking, well, it was something that I did or said that led to this chain of events. It could have ended in someone losing their life. It could have ended in some other bad decision that somebody could have made. But the fact of the matter is, we had nothing to do with it. We had nothing to do with it. You can control your actions. That's what you have control over. And that's what we're always doing in our struggle with these anxiety spectrum conditions. We're always struggling to be the masters of the universe. We're always struggling for control. And that's where this personalization thought pattern, that's where it's born from. But because it turns negative, especially if we're clinically depressed, it turns negative, and it will feed itself. You'll start making connections that aren't real, and the connection will always be negative. I want you guys to understand that you're not going to be making a positive connection. You could do the same thing in reverse and make all kinds of positive connections. Certain personality types do this, like narcissists. They'll take credit for all kinds of stuff that they have nothing to do with. And people do have a tendency, to get too big for their britches. I remember a long past coach in basketball said one time, he said he couldn't coach the kids these days. He said they don't realize God did it. They think they did it, and so, people can take credit for all kinds of things that maybe are an accident of genetics, or, just being born into the right family or whatever. We can get really a big head and think that we're greater than we are. But that's not what this is. This is the exact opposite on steroids. This is feeling bad. Someone falls down across the room from you, and somehow you should have been able to prevent that. How? Are you a magician? I mean, do you have superpowers? This is a really, and it seems almost silly, but it's not silly, because I've watched this. I've watched people that I love with this particular negative thought pattern, this personalization. And I've watched them feel like they were responsible for the negative actions of others, for things that are going on in the world, for all types of things. And this feeds itself, and it will take somebody who's already clinically depressed, and I feel like it can push them to a very dark place, because whether it's what's going on internally, or even if they look at what's going on around them, they're drawing a negative correlation that's about them. And it's a way to make it so you end up hating yourself. And that's the exact opposite of how we should be. Another thing this does, obviously, it makes you feel guilty. You're going to feel guilty all the time about things that you have no control over and you had nothing to do with. You're not responsible for inflation or the wars that are going on in the world right now. You're not responsible for that. You're not responsible for mistakes people that you love make in their lives. You're only responsible for your own actions. And we will make plenty of mistakes. And in talking about this, I'm not in any way, shape, or form trying to say that we shouldn't take responsibility or accountability for our actions. That's an important part of developing as a human being. That's an important part of becoming a better human being. But that's not what this is. And for a lot of you out there with anxiety and depression, you'll recognize this thought pattern right away. because I know that's how I felt, especially when I was deeply clinically depressed. I felt like I have this beautiful family, right? Two children at the time, this beautiful family, beautiful wife. And I felt like a smear or a smudge on a beautiful painting. That's how I felt. And it had everything to do with taking responsibility, not just for, things that I should have taken responsibility for, but for everything going on with everyone. And that's too much for anybody to handle, right? Nobody can handle that. Another thing that, just some side points before I wrap up the video about personalization. There's been a connection made with childhood trauma and abuse, things of that nature that predispose people to this negative thought pattern, because a lot of the time in those environments, you are blamed for things incorrectly, things that you should never be blamed for, things that should have never happened in the first place, right? But that's how those people manipulate their victims. Anyways, that's a terrible thing and another subject entirely. But this is a difficult thought pattern to unlearn. It is, when you get in that habit of doing this to yourself. And I feel like, the things you have to remember in order to, when you're in a deep clinical depression, or you're, deeply anxious, generalized anxiety disorder, it'll be really hard to do a lot of the cognitive behavioral therapy. It's going to be. And anyone who tells you differently has never been there. So it's going to be really hard to do some of these things. But as you improve, as you start to get better, as the anxiety goes down a little and the depression goes down a little, that's when you'll be able to apply these things. The first thing you have to do, the first question you have to ask yourself to get rid of this thought pattern is, were you really in control of this negative thing, whatever it might have been? It could be a small negative thing. It could be, someone, spent too much money, or, so it can be a little family matter, or it could be a big thing. Did you really have any control over it? That's the first question you ask yourself. The next question you would want to ask yourself is, was it your responsibility? If it's not your responsibility and you didn't have any control over it, get it out of your head and stop blaming yourself. You have nothing to do, again, with the actions of other people. You have nothing to do with world events. I'm sorry, but you don't control the weather. These things they're nothing to do with you. And, if you start looking for negative things that you can blame yourself for, you'll be able to find a nice trail all the way back to your birth. And it won't be an honest correlation. It's completely based on this predisposed negative self-talk and self-thinking, but you'll form the connections. There'll be no shortage of connections to form. And we already have enough, as imperfect human beings, we already have enough stuff to feel guilty for, or that we could legitimately take responsibility for. So that's why when you pile on, say you're clinically depressed, and then you pile on with this negative thought pattern, it can take you to a really dark place. And that's not what we want. We don't want something that is going to abate. It's going to get better, but it takes you to such a dark place that you don't see any way out of it but to end things. That is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. And I do plan in the future on touching on that subject a little more in depth. But I try to always keep things from my perspective. And, I haven't had too much of an issue with that type of ideation, but I do have some history of it, and I have people that are very close to me whom I love very much who have battled that. So, and I think, you know, right now there's a crisis, right? Especially amongst teenagers who are making a final decision that they have there's no business making that decision ever, but especially when you're so young and you have so much of your life ahead of you. But that is definitely part of the reason why I made this video, because this negative thought pattern, I think, leads people to feeling worthless and like they are to blame for everything bad. And nobody is. And, you know, a lot of these people, again, I told you guys, a lot of the people with anxiety spectrum conditions and depression, they're people who care very deeply about others. They care very deeply about everything, you know. And certainly going around carrying this burden of guilt for things that have nothing to do with you is not what you want to do. And you don't want to be in a place where it feels like it's too much to bear. So, one thing before I wrap up the video, if you've learned this type of thought pattern, whether it be from childhood trauma, whether it be from having anxiety and depression and how that can turn everything negative, you know, this is kind of like internal catastrophizing, right? With, you know, superpowers where you're somehow in control of things you're not in control of. And, you know, the first thing that you want to do if you've battled stuff like this or are currently battling it, seek treatment. Go see a mental health professional. They will no doubt engage in cognitive behavioral therapy with you, and it can be very beneficial. I always tell you guys too, pharmaceutical intervention may be involved, especially if you're deeply clinically depressed, because that's a very unnatural state. Deep clinical depression, that level of emotional deadness is not anything that was intended to be part of the human experience. So make sure you get help. Also, anytime you're battling any of these, I always talk about the big three: get your sleep, get your exercise, and try to make sure that whatever diet you consume, you're controlling it. It's not controlling you. And try desperately not to eat in order to self-medicate, whether it's to lift your depression or whether it's to quell your anxiety. At best, these are going to give you, you know, eating is going to give you a very brief relief, and then you're going to end up in in a place where you're even more depressed, because you'll be heavier, you'll feel worse, your cortisol levels will elevate. So anyways, this has already gone a little longer than I wanted to, but again, I think this was a really important video to make, because this personalization or negative personalization that is a thought pattern, a cognitive distortion that I think has led to people being in a very dark place, and also kept people from recovering from clinical depression as well as anxiety. So guys, thanks so much for tuning into the channel. I am grateful for all of the engagement. Like, share, subscribe. If anybody you know is, you know, enduring any of these anxiety spectrum conditions or clinical depression, have them take a look at some of the videos. It really could be helpful. But thank you so much. And until my next video, take care.